Hello, my friends. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Glennis Chester, and I am the host for the NFRW Empower Hour. This is your series from NFRW where we discuss the topics that are forefront in today's conversations. We bring you the tools to speak with authority on those topics that are most important in today's political landscape. We bring you experts in the field of every topic that you're hearing about on the news, the things that are important to you right now and today. And we want you to be able to not only be part of those conversations, but to be a leader. And so we're bringing you the experts that can help give you the knowledge and the tools to speak and pass on the information that you get from NFRW. So today's program, I am so very excited about this evening's topic. We've all heard that the 2020 election was stolen ad nauseum, actually. You hear it all the time. In fact, probably too many times to count. But that may or may not be totally true, depending on your perspective. And tonight, we're really going to get down into the nitty gritty of what happened in 2020, because it's very, very important. Was there cheating? Absolutely. But was there enough cheating to swing the election? Maybe not. And the reason I say that is because what really happened is even more nefarious than simple writing extra ballots and pulling them out from underneath the desk and throwing them into the pile. And what really happened was so much worse. But we cannot fight against the rigging of an election if we don't know the truth of what happened. So we are bringing in an expert tonight to tell us all about it. And if you have not heard Mollie, you are going to love her. So tonight, I'm so excited. Our guest is Mollie Hemingway. She is an author and Fox News contributor. She's the editor-in-chief of The Federalist. If you haven't read it, please Google it tonight, look it up. You are going to want to start reading The Federalist. She's a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College. She's a regular member of the Fox News All-Stars, which I'm sure you've all seen on Brett Baer's show. She's the author of Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation, and the Future of the Supreme Court, which if you haven't read that book, you're going to want to read that one too, because it's really, really good. And of course, the one we're going to talk about tonight, Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. And it's not just the 2020 elections, but it has such long-lasting repercussions into future elections. So it's so important. I'm just thrilled that she has agreed to join us here tonight, especially since she's traveling and is Zooming to us tonight from a hotel room, which is never fun, but I appreciate it, Mollie. But before we get to the good stuff, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep yourselves muted. If you have questions, please type them into the chat, and I know you will, because this has been such a big topic for everyone over the last few years. Type them in, and Erica and Kim will collect all the questions, make sure that we don't have a bunch of duplicates, but the most important ones and most vital ones to the majority of people up on the top, and fill me in on the back end. We'll answer as many as we can at the end of the program tonight. And a huge thank you to our technical gurus this evening, Kim Bowers and Erica Watley, whom I could never, ever do a program without, because technical is not my specialty. It's so, so important. So thank you so much, Mollie. I can't wait to just dive right in. So I'm going to let you take it from here, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I always have to mention that my mother is a Republican woman, and so it's great to be with other Republican women. When my parents got married, my mom converted to Lutheranism. My dad is a Lutheran pastor, and my dad eventually, over time, converted to being a Republican. So they both made some major changes, and for the better, I think. But and I'm thrilled to be here to talk about this important issue of election integrity. If questioning the results of a presidential election were a crime, as many people have said in recent years, the entire Democrat Party and the entire media establishment would be in prison right now. The last time that Democrats fully accepted the legitimacy of a presidential election that they lost was in 1988. After the 2000 election, which hinged on the results of a recount in Florida that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Democrats smeared President George W. Bush as selected, not elected. When he won re-election against then Senator John Kerry in 2004, many people on the left developed a theory that he had won because voting machines in Ohio had been rigged to deliver fraudulent results in favor of Bush. This was a major theory on the left for a very long period of time. HBO produced and aired an Emmy-nominated documentary called Hacking Democracy. You had Senate hearings on this issue for years. I mean, every major senator took part in these hearings where they believed that this had happened in Ohio. And the documentary Hacking Democracy claimed that votes can be stolen without a trace. But nothing compares to what happened in 2016 when Donald Trump surprised so many people by defeating former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. So rather than come to terms with the reality that Trump had won and Clinton had lost fair and square, the political and media establishments sought to come up with a theory to explain away Trump's victory. And they settled on this extremely destructive conspiracy theory that crippled the government, empowered America's adversaries, illegally targeted innocent private citizens whose only crime had been not supporting Hillary Clinton. And this theory was the Russia collusion hoax. It had all the elements of a standard election conspiracy theory, including baseless claims of hacked voting totals, illegal voter suppression, treasonous collaboration with a foreign power. For years, pundits openly speculated that President Donald Trump was a Russian spy and that members of his cabinet were under the thumb of the Kremlin. But despite how absurd all this was, this belief had the support of all the most powerful institutions and individuals and even government agencies in the country. And to question the legitimacy of the 2016 election wasn't to undermine our democracy. It was considered by some of our most elevated public figures as a patriotic duty. You know, Hillary Clinton told people, you can run the best campaign, you can even become the nominee, and you can have the election stolen from you. That's a direct quote from her. She said she knew that Donald Trump was an illegitimate president. Former President Jimmy Carter told NPR in 2019 that Trump lost the election and was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf. He said Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. This view was shared by most prominent Democrats in Congress. Representative John Lewis refused to go to Trump's inauguration in 2016 because he believed that Trump was illegitimate. 1 out of 3 Democrats boycotted Trump's inauguration. And corporate media didn't condemn these people at all. They amplified the most speculative claims of how Trump and Russia had colluded to steal the election from Clinton. They dutifully regurgitated inaccurate leaks from corrupt intelligence officials, suggesting that Trump and his staff had committed treason. They ran stories arguing that Republicans who didn't support their conspiracy theory were insufficiently loyal to the country or somehow compromised themselves. And it was all complete, insane nonsense. So even Robert Mueller, who ran that multi-year, multi-million-dollar investigation, found nothing to support these fevered accusations. But the reporters who pushed this conspiracy theory were never held accountable by their peers for peddling these leaks and lies. They received raises and promotions, honors and awards, and the applause of their colleagues. Some were given Pulitzer Prizes. From 2016 through 2020, the easiest way to achieve political stardom was to loudly proclaim your belief that the 2016 election was stolen. And then 2020 happened. At the drop of a hat, America's electoral system went from irredeemably corrupt and broken in 2016 to unquestionably safe in 2020. Voting methods that were supposedly used to steal elections in 2004 and 2016 suddenly became so sacrosanct and unquestionable in 2020. So you had election experts repeatedly warn about the pitfalls of electronic voting and widespread unsupervised balloting. But by November 2020, any discussion about the vulnerabilities of those methods was written off as the stuff of right-wing cranks and conspiracy mongers. And that was kind of weird just on its face, because dismissing all of this required people to just ignore very real problems with election integrity that have affected hundreds of US elections at the state and local levels, and even presidential elections. In 1960, when JFK won, he won by just 118,000 more votes than Nixon. And that electoral college win hinged on victories in Illinois, where Chicago had suspiciously high vote totals for Kennedy, and Texas, a state that Lyndon B. Johnson had long controlled and had previously rigged elections in favor of him or his candidates. And people really think that one or both of those states would have been won by Nixon in a fair election. And then 2020 itself had massive problems. And so that's what my book really goes into, what those massive problems were. Thanks mostly to the coronavirus pandemic, you had hundreds of laws and processes that were changed at the state, local, and federal levels. What's interesting about these changes is they were changes that the Democrat Party had actually long sought. And the COVID pandemic enabled them to be pushed through, even though they'd been trying to make these changes for decades. Time magazine called it a revolution in how people vote. Now, some of those changes were enacted by state legislatures, some by courts, and others by state and county election officials. And that's important because the Constitution requires changes to election laws to be handled by state legislatures. Sometimes they happen that way. Frequently, they did not. The bedrock of American elections is that, or the bedrock of the American Republic is that elections should be free, fair, accurate, and trusted. And election lawyers will tell you that fraud is almost impossible to conclusively find after the fact, and that to fight it, strong rules and regulations are needed on the front end. And that's why people fight so much about this. What worried a lot of people about 2020 was the emphasis on unsupervised mail-in balloting. Those laws and processes that were changed enabled tens of millions of unsupervised ballots to flood into the system. And that is long known as the primary source of potential fraud. In 2005, there was a bipartisan committee co-chaired by Jimmy Carter that acknowledged that absentee balloting, unsupervised, absentee balloting was the largest source of potential fraud in American elections. You've had people ban unsupervised balloting, like France banned it in the 1970s because of problems with fraud. The Washington Post, the New York Times, all openly acknowledged that elections were less trustworthy when they were plagued by widespread unsupervised balloting. And that was a problem in part because our election system has problems with how we handle voter registration. It was just this week, by the way, that I think the Colorado Secretary of State, who's crazy lefty, admitted that they accidentally mailed out 30,000 postcards to illegal aliens, encouraging them to register to vote. You have problems with voter registration all over the country. A 2012 Pew study found that 24 million voter registrations in the United States, which is like 1 in 8, are no longer valid or significantly inaccurate. That is a number greater than the population of Florida or New York State. Pew's total included 1.8 million dead people and another 2.75 million Americans who are registered to vote in at least 2 states. And so when you're having widespread distribution of ballots to all of these addresses that are on voter registration lists that don't actually match with real voters, of course that increases opportunities for fraud or other irregularities. You also had ballot harvesting, which was a new feature that went widespread in 2020, where you have third-party participants in the voting process. And then you also had this situation where you had expanded voting periods where you have people voting for weeks at a time, and you might not even find out how people voted for weeks after the election. Okay, so that was one big issue, changing all these laws and processes to have widespread mail-in balloting. Another part of the book that I really focused on is how there was also a coordinated campaign to engage in the private takeover of government election offices. So Mark Zuckerberg, one of the world's wealthiest and most powerful men, invested $419 million through two very left-wing partisan groups who gave grants to people to help out with get out the vote efforts. Now, technically, both Republican and Democrat counties could and did apply for these funds and did receive them. But the disparity in the focus of the funding was significantly partisan. So Zuckerberg's groups primarily funded the blue areas of swing states and financed all these left-wing activists to come into the government and run Democrat get out the vote operations through government election offices. The two groups are called the Center for Tech and Civic Life and Center for Election Integrity and Research, or Center for Election Innovation and Research. And so, you know, Pennsylvania, you would give 5,000 to a small, you'd give 5,000 to a Republican county and then like 10 million to Philadelphia. And they would use those to run massive get out the vote operations, of course, privileging Democrat voters. You know, one of the things I thought was interesting, Center for Tech and Civic Life focused mostly on county-based funding. Center for Election Innovation and Research gave money to states, not localities. And they spent more than half of their funds on Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So those combined states got like 36 million, compared to Florida, which got 250,000. Georgia was heavily funded by both groups. Even though, you know, it's half the size of Florida, it got more than 4 times the funding Florida got from the first group, Center for Tech and Civic Life. And it's interesting to me to compare Florida and Georgia because Florida was a state that has spent a lot of time on improving its election laws after what they put the country through in 2000. And so they're less susceptible to sort of tinkering with these outside groups. But Florida went 1 point Republican in 2016. It was heavily targeted by Democrat activists and Republican activists in 2020, and it ended up going 3% for Republicans in 2020. Georgia was a 5 point Republican state in 2016. And after this funding and emphasis from the Zuckerberg groups, it ended up going 1 point for Democrats. This private interference in the running of a national election had never even been attempted to happen in the history of the country. It was massive. It absolutely determined the outcome of the election, and it is, frankly, appalling. There are 2 other things I also think are important for people who care about this topic to think about. And one is that free and fair elections require a free and fair media environment. International election observers will say that if a country has a propaganda press, that their elections cannot be considered to be reliable. And I know Republicans have complained for a long period of time about bias in corporate media. The first Republican president to complain about it was, I believe, Eisenhower. That goes back a long time. I remember the favorite bumper sticker of George H.W. Bush was "Annoy the media, re-elect Bush." So it's a long-standing complaint. But what has happened in the last 10 years or so is moving from mere bias into outright propaganda. And you have a media that make up stories that are fake, that suppress stories that are real, and they do it on the regular. They do it all the time, and it really can affect elections. You know, bias can affect elections, but we're talking about something so much worse. And we also have, the other thing I think is important to think about is the routine censorship by social media platforms of non-leftist voices and negative news stories, again, about Democrats. So, you see this in how in this collusion between big tech and big media, where they suppress news stories that are damaging to Democrats. Most notably, this happened with the very true, 100% true stories about the Biden family business. And the Biden family business is where you give huge sums of cash to members of the Biden family. And it's not just Hunter Biden, it's also James Biden and other members of the Biden family. You can be a powerful communist Chinese affiliated company or Ukrainian oligarch, or any number of different types of people. You're giving money to Biden family members in exchange for what the political arm of the family, which is Joe Biden, can offer or deliver in terms of US policy or funding issues. This is an important story. I mean, just journalistically speaking, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, it's important for Americans to understand the Biden family business, how it works, the opportunities for corruption. We're talking about policies that affect Americans, whether it's with Ukraine, which we're spending a lot of money right now funding a war in Ukraine that the Biden family is intimately involved in. It can be about our policy toward China, which is undeniably our largest adversary, our most significant adversary. Biden has been on record saying he views them as friends. We see a dramatic change in posture toward China from the previous administration to this administration. That should have been covered. And instead, we had a media that refused to cover it. And then when one newspaper did cover it, and a few media outlets covered it, they were violently suppressed by big tech. This is extremely important for all future elections, and something needs to be done about it. But it is true that in 2020, Time Magazine, a few months after the election, they wrote a thing about how, it is a quote, a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies working behind the scenes influenced perceptions, changed rules and laws, steered media coverage, and controlled the flow of information. Now, Time, which is a left-wing corporate media publication, claimed that that was fortifying the election. I think all reasonable people would agree that that well-funded cabal of powerful people were engaged in rigging the election by changing our election laws suddenly, enabling the private takeover of government election offices, controlling the free flow of information through propaganda press and big tech. And there's actually like a lot more, but those are kind of the big picture issues here. I'm really glad that people are beginning to focus on what's happening with election integrity. It's something that Republicans should have been focused on for a long period before now, but it's good that they're more and more focused. And I think it's important, since this is a Republican group, to know that one of the issues that was affecting the Republican Party was that they were being held under a consent decree that lasted nearly 40 years. This was an issue where there had been, some kind of conflict in an off-year election in New Jersey in the early 80s. And a left-wing judge put the Republican Party under a decree saying they basically couldn't get involved in election day oversight. And this judge was so partisan and so political that he kept the Republican Party under this decree for decades, literally like 36 years. It took, so when he retired, he took senior status, which is the thing that enables judges to keep hearing certain cases. He took senior status just so he could keep the Republican Party from being engaged in election day oversight. And he finally died in, a few years back, and he was replaced on this case by another, Democrat appointed judge. And that judge, when he was given the opportunity to keep Republicans under this consent decree, was like, this is ridiculous, let them free. So that all changed in 2018. So 2020 was the first election where Republicans could actually engage in election day litigation and oversight. It's frankly amazing that Republicans were able to win as many elections as they did given that they were operating in this completely unfair environment for nearly 40 years. And a lot was done ahead of the 2020 election. A lot more is being done right now. And it's not just Republican Party officially, but there's a whole, there are all sorts of different conservative groups that are involved in this just for the sake of the security of our elections. And so people are working on everything from, voter roll cleanup to, lobbying for better laws and processes. You are seeing those improvements being made in many states. There's a lot of work to be done, but a lot of work is being done. And so that's my overview of the book, which clearly there's a lot of interest in the book because it sold very well, but I'm happy to talk about any specific questions on election integrity or anything else you guys would like to ask about.
Okay, well, just really quickly before we start delving into the questions that have been entered, one of the things that I found very, very interesting that you talked about more when I first met you at the RNC was that 2020 wasn't lost in 2020. It was lost in 2018, or maybe even a little bit earlier. But we don't think of elections in that way. We think of our season, our election season as, a year, maybe 9 months. But the election season really starts when you put your Secretary of State in office. And that was a huge thing, was that we don't really pay attention to who our Secretary of State is. So could you talk a little bit more about the profound impact that your Secretary of State has on the election of each state and how it's run?
Absolutely. And it's an incredibly important office. And we saw the importance of that office in 2020. But many of the people who were in office in 2020 won their elections in 2018. The left has understood that secretaries of state are incredibly important. And there was actually a literal Soros-funded project. I can't remember I think it was called SOS. I can't remember what it was. It was some sort of plot to install left-wing secretaries of state that had been going. I think it started in like 2000 or something like that. It probably started after 2004, maybe. It was a really highly coordinated, well-financed attempt to get left-wing secretaries of state in office. And the reason why that's important is because on election day, a good secretary of state is not in any way partisan, just believes in rule of law and implementing those laws, fairly and honestly. On election day and in post-election litigation, the Secretary of State has a lot of power to control anything from audits to recounts to, previous to election day, they offer guidance in most states on how to interpret the laws that are on the books. And so when you look at the problems that happened, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, many other states, most of those were from secretaries of state who did not have who kind of like knew what they were doing, I would say, if they were on the left, or didn't know what they were doing if they were on the right, in terms of protecting those elections. It is, I think, just like one of the most important offices that's out there and has been for a long time. And you can't sleep on that. Like, the left has very much understood how having an ally in office on election challenges it's everything.
So what is the balance now? Do you know offhand where we're at, Republican versus Democrats, in number of office holders for SOS?
I don't think there's much of a change. I think I don't know. I actually don't know, so I can't say. But again, you look at, like, I'm thinking of examples even after election day in Arizona, there were some challenges that were put forth, and, the Democrat Secretary of State there got extremely vindictive and didn't even want the challenges to continue, threatened people that she would threatened people who were making challenges that if they didn't immediately withdraw those challenges, she would go after disbarment for them, for instance.
Wow.
And so, having a good Secretary of State who will allow challenges to go forth or will support rule of law, can make a big difference. But I have no idea about the actual numbers. It's a good question.
I'm just curious. Okay, Kim and Erica, what do we have in our chat? Do we have any questions?
Hi, Glynis, I have a couple questions. So the first one is, what are the top three things we as Republican Party activists need to be doing before the November election?
So I'm not sure exactly on the answer in terms of party activism, but for the topic of election integrity, which I actually think is kind of a nonpartisan issue, like people should care about the integrity of their elections regardless of what party they're in. The number one thing I think to be doing is to be monitoring elections already. So this already should be happening. Most states have this long period of early voting and absentee voting. So I think a lot of volunteers in the political process, they think that if they're going to work the polls, that means working the polls on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. But we don't have election day anymore. We have election season. And election season has, in my state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, we've had voting for a few weeks. Some people have had it even longer. Some people might not have such expansive early voting. And you need to be monitoring those votes more than any other votes, because those are the unsupervised ballots. So any oversight you can get on that process is key. Real quick note, I want to say, when I was writing the book, I interviewed Attorney General Barr, and he was very opposed to this long period of voting, because he was saying that having super long periods of voting is like having a jury trial where you tell every member of the jury that they can render a verdict at any point in the process. He was saying there's something good about Americans coming together on the same day with the same set of information, the same facts, and coming to consensus, casting their vote, and then having those votes quickly counted, everyone kind of agreeing with the results, and then moving on. We're moving so far away from that, and it's really bad, I think, for the country. But in Virginia, we have off-year elections relative to most of the country. And so last year, there was huge interest in doing oversight of elections. And some of these people who were doing oversight, weeks before election day, they noticed that there were that ballots were being accepted that did not have appropriate security with them. So you're supposed to have the last 4 digits of your social security number or something like that. And the left-wing Democrat-controlled Fairfax County was accepting ballots that did not pass muster. So they were able to file a challenge immediately. Now, because of some shenanigans with our justice system, they lost on standing, which is insane. But I think by just being there and showing that they were observing the process, it tightened things up and made people realize they had to be a little more careful. So, the issue with fraud is people will take advantage of situations that they think they can. And so the more that you are there and active and present, and you understand what your local laws are, and you get to know your government workers who are administering elections well, and you get along with them well, and the more knowledge you can have, the better it is for everybody in your midst. So that's one answer, but that's the best answer.
Okay, so you would say get on your ballot board so that you can be looking at early votes, also like overseas ballots. Do those come into your ballot board as well?
So every state and locality has different rules, as it should be, because the Constitution allows state legislatures to set their own rules. What that means is, the differences are just massive everywhere, in terms of how the votes are coming in, where they're processed. So what's important is that you learn what the rules are in your state or in your county. And the other thing I want to say is that sometimes people get to know their own county really well, but their county might be fine. Their county might be like where you really want to be watching is in the areas that historically have had the most fraud. You can go to the congressional record and see that in the 1800s, people were noting that there was massive amounts of fraud in densely populated industrial areas. the fraud is there just in the same way, like the reason why banks get robbed is because that's where the money is. The reason why densely populated areas are prone to fraud is because it's just easier and more efficient, and you get more payoff for doing it than like going and committing fraud in the most rural part of your state. And so it's important to not just check out your own county where you might not have any problems, but go to those areas where there might not be many Republican observers, and make sure you staff those. And you have to follow the rules. Again, sometimes they require that people live in that county or that state, but make sure those areas that are most prone to fraud in your state have the appropriate amount of oversight.
Excellent. So definitely see that ballot board. Definitely for the day of elections, you want to be a clerk, or even early voting, be a clerk, be a ballot judge, be a poll watcher. Anything, the more eyes on you have, the better we are. Even if you can't do anything, then a case can be made. If it ever goes to court, there's a written record that there was, a complaint or a problem or whatever. So that's great.
If I could just point out again why it's important to know your own state laws. And by the way, the Republican Party at the federal level, the national level, has been coming up with systems. And so I don't know who the right people are to talk to, but they will help guide you through where you need to be. But the reason why knowing the differences state by state are important, I remember when I was researching the book, like some states say that unless you make a challenge to a ballot at the moment you see the problem, you can't do anything. Others actually say you can't make a challenge to the ballot when you see the problem. You have to record it and like someone deals with it elsewhere or later. The differences are really significant. But one thing that's great about the current moment is people are aware of what those differences are. They give training in those. There are groups that provide training to ballot workers. You can get some or to some election, poll workers. You can get that training online, or you can get it through your party. And it's really streamlined in a nice way now relative to 4 years ago.
That's terrific. Thank you. Okay, what else do we have?
Another question, what can we do to overcome media bias? People still believe the Russia hoax is true and that the laptop contents are insignificant.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. I'm pleasantly surprised, or pleasantly reading those polls, which show that 9% of the country puts any faith in corporate media, or 9% of Republicans, I think, say that they trust corporate media. But you still see that a lot of people on the left do trust corporate media. And why wouldn't they? Like, they're their best friends. They do everything for the Democrat Party. They push their messaging every day. So it's not surprising that they would, not have negative feelings about it. I would say the important thing I think for Republicans to do, and this is one of those things that confuses me that they don't do this, is to reject the legitimacy of these left-wing propaganda outlets that purport to be news organizations. Like, I have noticed that there are some senators, governors, and other people who are refusing to pretend like they're anything other than partisan actors. You see Ron DeSantis say he's not going to open press availability to propagandists at these left-wing media outlets. Or I saw Marco Rubio was asked a question recently about, the big Democrat messaging right now is on abortion. And he made someone who asked a question on it fill out a form showing like they were supposed to list all the questions they'd asked of Democrats about their extreme abortion position. And then once they filled out that form, showing that they had legitimately asked these tough questions of Democrats about the extremism of their abortion position, then he would answer their question. And the media outlet tweeted it out like, what's going on here? Like, he thinks he has the right to tell us, who we have to ask. Of course he has the right to do that. And far more disconcerting to me are these purported Republican leaders who allow left-wing media to treat Republicans and their voters like second-class citizens. That was bad 20 years ago. It's inexcusable now. They should not be allowed to harm the country the way they are. If CNN and Washington Post and New York Times created and pushed this Russia collusion hoax, there should be repercussions for that. And so I think, there's not so much like average people can do on issues like that. But the average person thing to do, I also think, relates to how people get their news. It was at actually a National Federation of Republican Women event that someone told me that they asked people the number one way that they get news and information, or they asked people to rank how they get their news and information. And far and away, the number one way that people get their news and information is by talking to friends and family members. And I think it shows the importance of being well informed and just communicating with the people that you know, and just sharing news and real information. And that will have more of an impact than anything else. And I would have to also say, support those media outlets that are willing to, courageously fight against these dominant media narratives. My publication, The Federalist, that's what we do every day. We wake up every day and we think, what lies are being spread and how do we fight them journalistically? And there are good outlets out there, and you should make sure you support them.
There's at least 2 or 3. Okay, what else do we have, Kim?
Could you explain the dissent decree that was not extended? How did it limit the RNC in the past?
How did it limit the
RNC, Republican National Party?
Oh, so the case actually stemmed from a New Jersey governor's race where Republicans were doing I think like what they'd done is they sent mailers to an area that was prone to election corruption, reminding people not to cheat. And this judge found that violated some like civil rights law related to voting. And as punishment said, you can't do any election day oversight or litigation from the RNC. So technically speaking, state or local RNC chapters could engage in election oversight, but without that help of coordination from the national level, it just made it much less efficient. And mostly what it meant is that the legal arm of the RNC had to become laser focused on training people not to do election day oversight or litigation. Like you couldn't challenge election results. You couldn't do any kind of like, things like we were just talking about, mailers to people to make sure that, you just couldn't do really anything related to election integrity. Organizing poll workers, organizing operations to communicate about things that were happening in a given state or whatnot. It was so sensitive that in 2016, it was almost extended because Vanity Fair had done a profile of the Trump campaign, and they noted, or had done, had written some hit piece on the Trump campaign, and they noted that Sean Spicer was like on the 7th floor of Trump Tower, and he was supposed to be on the 8th floor of Trump Tower, because that's how sensitive this decree was. And so they almost extended it again, but by that time the judge had died and been replaced by this other person. But it just kind of made it so that the legal team just had to train people not to do anything related to the integrity of the elections. And so even though they got out of it in 2018, which meant that by 2020 they could engage in election day oversight, they said that like their muscle memory wasn't there. Like they just spent 40 years not doing election oversight or not doing election day litigation. And so it had really kind of warped things. But now they, now they're definitely hitting the ground running, and they've done a lot, in this cycle to improve that.
That's great. It's true. When I first heard about it, this couldn't be true.
Oh,
this couldn't be true.
I actually heard about it from Rana, and I thought, I like her, but I was like, there's no way that's true. And I looked it up, and I was like, oh, this is completely true. And I couldn't believe it wasn't like major.
And nobody knew about it.
Yeah. I mean, people would write about it in the Washington Post or Politico, but they would treat it like as a matter of fact thing, like, well, and of course, Republicans have to do this with 2 hands tied behind their back because, that's the way it should be. But it was just, it was a huge advantage Democrats had for nearly 40 years.
It's crazy. Okay, Kim, what else we have?
I think we just have one more. If we live in a state where the Secretary of State isn't trustworthy, what can we do to ensure integrity in the upcoming election? We're already working with the county clerk, but not all counties are trustworthy either.
Yeah, I mean, there are some states that are really problematic, and there have also been some, unfortunate losses in recent, primaries or other things. So it is a common situation that people might live in a state with a bad Secretary of State. I think you want to be in very good communication with your party apparatus. They're going to be as aware of as anybody, like even at the national level. You just want to be watching them like a hawk. You want to look for, you just want to get like almost obsessively focused on what kind of guidance they have coming out. This isn't quite a Secretary of State commission, but Wisconsin has something called the Wisconsin Election Commission, which sort of operates as a Secretary of State. They issue guidance all the time, and the guidance is horrible and sort of was eventually knocked down by courts in certain scenarios, but they were the ones who kind of allowed these unsupervised ballot harvesting operations, or allowed, Democrat ballots to be cured if they didn't match with state law. And you just have to get comfortable with the idea that a lot of what you're going to be doing is litigation. Unfortunately, not that you all are necessarily interested in it, but you need to collect the information that can be used to help litigate some of these cases. And just recording what's happening can have huge downstream effects.
Excellent.
Maybe pray. I don't know.
Glynis, I did have one additional one jump in if you want me to.
Sure, we've got time.
What are your thoughts of county-wide voting?
What is that? I'm not sure what that means, actually.
I don't either.
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, maybe whoever wrote that can expound upon that a little bit in the chat.
Yep.
But until then, I know one of the questions that I get all the time is, would you recommend early voting or day of voting? Because we keep hearing both sides for a more likely to not have your vote stolen, fixed, changed, conveniently lost.
So first of all, early voting just means that you're voting at a polling location, but voting prior to election day.
Right.
The big issue, I think, is with unsupervised mail-in balloting versus early or day of voting. I never even cared about this topic that much before I researched and wrote the book, and then I became completely reactionary about it. Like, I now believe quite strongly that there's a reason why our country moved to one day of voting with very important privacy protections and integrity protections. And our history in this country is one of ever-changing voting laws, but we actually moved to a single day of voting because there were problems with long periods of election days, going over time. We moved to a private ballot with privacy curtains, with the government handing out a ballot to avoid the corruption that we've seen. So even though I know that like every single election integrity issue is extremely popular with the American people, Democrat, Republican, black, white, except they like mail-in balloting. And I think that people should not like mail-in balloting so much because it's just too ripe for, not just fraud, but just like shenanigans or problems. So, but I also want to mention that one of the things that was really interesting about 2020 was that when all these COVID things started happening, both Republicans and Democrats started asking their most, partisan people what they thought about voting. And people don't even quite understand why, but Republicans overwhelmingly believe in voting in person. And Democrats really trust unsupervised balloting. It's a really interesting partisan divide. And I don't weigh in on what I'm sure the Republican Party has a theory about when people should vote. I get the feeling they do want people to early vote, but I don't weigh in on that. Just in general, I think a stronger system would be just like a single day of voting with maybe some exceptions for people who can't make it on that day, but also in person, and, you know, extremely limited unsupervised balloting for like, you know, military and extreme cases. That's my personal view.
Well, I think the reason that that poll went the way it did down party lines is because Republicans don't have any drop off points for voting in their neighborhood. It just doesn't work like that.
Well, that's one of the issues with the disparity in these treatment, you know, with the ballot harvesting. I do see that Janet said that the question on county-wide voting would be voting in any precinct in a county. I do want to point out that, you know, this is another like Secretary of State issue. I love secretaries of state, so I always want people to think through what it's like for them. Each, you know, in certain places, different precincts actually are voting on different things. So an argument against county-wide voting or statewide voting, where you can vote anywhere you want, is that you get printed a ballot relative to what you're legally allowed to vote on, and where you live really does affect a lot of things. You know, your state legislature, your state senate, your town council, all these things. And countywide voting makes that extremely difficult to administer. And it makes it also difficult, like, you know, you think back to a period of time when people knew who was voting in a precinct. Like ideally, you're an election day of worker, like an actual worker, not an observer. You would ideally kind of know everybody who came in because you live in that neighborhood and you know your neighborhood. When you move to countywide or statewide, or like register wherever you want, any day you want, you know, on day of or whatever, you lose that personal touch where people know who's in their community, and it just opens itself again. I'm not saying you're committing fraud if you do countywide voting. It just makes it easier to commit fraud. And so anything that makes it easier, you know, human nature is what it is. And no one's immune from the, you know, desire to cheat. And if you make it easier to cheat, you're reasonably going to get more cheating, particularly when you can't check for the cheating very well. So, you know, good voter rolls that are established well before election day. This is another reform we made like 150 years ago in this country for good reason. That's a good thing, and it makes people, and you want ideally people to trust election results. So everything should be laser focused on, will this make people trust the outcome? And right now, Republicans have a lot of doubt, but Democrats have had that doubt too, and that's just not good for a republic that you want to survive.
I agree. Well, thank you so much, Mollie. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. I know I could just listen to you for hours and hours and hours. And if you haven't read the book, please pick it up today. It is so, so good. You can get it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere. It's out there, and it's excellent. And if you love it as much as I do, then get the one about the Kavanaugh hearings, because that was really, really good also. You have a gift. I will tell you that. You have a gift. So thank you so much, ladies, for joining me today. Please tell all your friends that weren't able to be here that they will be able to watch this episode of the Empower Hour on the NFRW website in the next couple of days. And let's see what we have here. If you enjoyed this month, you're going to love next month, because we have a special Veterans edition of the Empower Hour with NFRW's board member Monica Kozlowski and chair of the NFRW Armed Services Committee, Cease Tyler. So you'll want to join us for that. It's going to be really, really special. So watch your email to find out when that's going to be on. And until then, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your interest in election integrity, because that benefits all of us and it benefits our republic. So we will see you next month. That's all.